Good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first public lecture of the Wicn Autumn Public Lecture Series. My name is Stefan Böhm, and I'm the organizer of these events. Wicn actually stands for the Wales Institute in Cognitive Neuroscience. Thanks to the generous support from the Welsh Assembly government, researchers in the schools of psychology at Swansea, Cardiff, and Bangor University work together in the Wales Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience to investigate how the mind arises from the human brain. Wicn also makes this knowledge available to the public, hence, for example, public lectures. You might be interested, actually, to know that our public lectures are going to be recorded and will be made available later for watching in our Wicn website. So it's a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. David Carey. David received his undergrad degree in psychology from Queen's University in Canada and his master's in clinical neuropsychology from the University of Western Ontario in Canada. He stayed at Western Ontario for his PhD to study handedness and laterality. Dr. Carey then became a lecturer at the University of Aberdeen. We are pleased that David now has joined our School of Psychology as a reader. Tonight, Dr. Carey is going to talk about one of his favorite topics, hand and hemispheres. I believe he's also going to bust a few misconceptions about handedness on the way. Is that correct, David?
I hope so.
Okay, good. At the end of his talk, David is happy to take questions and discuss about his research. So, after his talk, if you have a couple of questions or a point you would like to discuss, please raise your hand and wait until we get a microphone to you so that everyone can hear you. And now, please welcome Dr. David Carey.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Good evening, everybody. I'm pleasantly surprised to see so many of you here. I'm wondering if you're the people who live somewhere along the A55 and the road's been cut up or something and you were looking for some place to get warm. You came in and suddenly you're listening to a talk on hands and the hemispheres. What I would like to do today is talk to you a little bit about handedness, and we'll focus more on human handedness than non-human handedness for a while. But I'll just talk to you briefly about comparisons between us and other species and why they're sometimes tricky to do. I think a large part of the talk, though, we're going to be focusing on this puzzle of the left-hander, and you'll see why in a short period of time. Then eventually we'll get to what handedness has to do with the brain, and then some recent new research that I've just started in my new lab here in Bangor University, which has to do with classifying left-handed people in a more fine-grained way than just asking them about their writing hand. And in fact, some of this work could be related to classifying a very, very small number of you in the audience who are right-handed. So that's the plan. And then, if I haven't completely run out of steam by then, we'll have some conclusions. Just to check, having a look at our studio audience here, can I ask how many of you, if you could raise your right hand, write with your right hand? How many of you write with your right hand? Okay, now have a look around you, and you can see clearly that we have quite a large majority of right-handers in the audience. How many of you can put your hands down now, thank you. How many of you write with your left hand? Raise your right hand or left hand. So, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, there's a handful here. Actually, probably statistically slightly more than you'd expect in an audience of this size, and that might be because you lefties are quite interested in your handedness, but that remains to be seen. So the best estimate suggests that in most Western cultures, people are about 90% of any kind of large sample of human beings would be right-handed for tasks like handwriting, but not just for things like writing. We're also pretty right-sided for other tasks too, such as brushing our hair, combing our teeth, cutting with a knife, or one of my particular favorite ones, throwing a ball. In fact, I was delighted to discover in Antwerp some years ago when I went for a visit that the hero, I think his name is Brabo. Anybody Belgian in the audience? He slayed an evil giant who was charging a toll to people for crossing the river. And so the hero slayed this giant and actually cut off his right hand in the process, which I thought was interesting. Because if he did that before the giant actually died, that would be quite distressing. Because as we know, giants are also 90% right-handed, just like heroes are. Are we the most right-handed species of all? Probably. probably. But to understand this point, what you have to appreciate is that individual animals will have a hand preference, a foot preference, a claw preference, or a paw preference. So if you have a dog or a cat at home, after you get home and have your late tea this evening, you can test your dog's paw preference. And how you do that is you take her favorite toy and you put it just out of reach between two cushions so that she has to reach for it with one paw or the other. And being a good experimental psychologist, you will repeat this many, many, many times. And what you'll discover is that your dog or cat has a paw preference. What's relevant here is that if you tested 100 or 1,000 dogs and cats, you'd get something probably approximating 50% right pawed and 50% left pawed. So some neuropsychologists and neuroscientists get very excited about this 90-10 ratio in our species, but my colleagues in primatology and comparative psychology tend to get a bit nervous about it, because after all, we're a great ape species. We share a substantial amount of our genome and our recent evolutionary history with other great apes, such as gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees. And so people have gone out into the wild and also into captive settings to see what proportion of these animals show a hand preference for skilled tasks such as preparing some types of food, or this is quite a popular one. There's a tube with tasty peanut butter and Nutella there that this orangutan is handling, and we know which one she holds it with this hand, but the dominant hand is thought to be the hand that actually tries to get the Nutella. But that's not the only species, actually, that people have looked for evidence of side preferences. One of my particular favorite species, the walrus, which, as you can read here, it's like a vampire, but awesome. I don't know why I put that in there, but a walrus is a little bit like a vampire, but awesome. At any rate, why would you talk about walrus-handedness? Actually, believe it or not, there's a study that purports to tell us a bit about walrus flipperedness, I suppose. But in the meantime, in our great ape colleagues like orangutans, actually the evidence for population level right-handedness isn't very good. In fact, it's about 50-50 in orangutans, maybe 60-65% in gorillas, and in chimps also, at least to my reckoning, around 60-65%, although recently one group has been making great claims for how chimps gesture. For example, in this case, stick out their hand to ask for food in captivity, but we won't talk about that. I just wanted to mention, though, that the walrus beats them all. The walrus, according to one study, is about 80% right flippered. And in fact, here's the evidence for you, because as we know, if it appears on BBC news page, it's got to be true. And here's the story. The walrus has been added to the growing list of animals that seem to prefer using one hand or flipper than the other. But if you actually bother to find out where the original paper was published, scientific paper, you dig it out and you look, what you discover is they had a camera down at the bottom of some aquatic environment where these walruses were feeding. And actually, apparently what they do is they dig. And when they dig, they have a flipper preference. But only when you get into the fine print of the paper do you discover that actually it was so murky down there, they really couldn't tell which walruses they were looking at. So it might have been that there were 100 walruses down there, and 80% of them did their digging with their right flipper. Or it might have been 5 walruses down there, and 4 out of 5 of them were digging with their right flipper on different occasions, right? So this is a kind of, believe it or not, a real statistical issue, power. Here's another species. I think this is a sulfur-crested cockatoo, and these guys are actually extremely left-footed. Actually, I'm not sure if I would say footed. So if you picture one of these birds living in its cage, it perches on something, and of course, you can actually test its preference, because if you hand it something tasty, it's going to have to reach out and grab it from you with one claw or the other. And it turns out, apparently, that these parrots are remarkably left-footed. Only 20 birds, though. But I started digging into this because I thought that's a pretty substantial asymmetry, actually. They're more asymmetrical than we are as a species. And it turns out there is a substantial literature on asymmetry in parrots. Here's one study. Here's another. Here's another. We've moved into parakeets by this stage, so really it's becoming quite a cottage industry. I was much surprised to discover that 20 years ago, there was so much research on footedness in parrots that somebody could write a review of it in the Canadian Journal of Psychology. 3 centuries of research, theory, and mere surmise. So I apologize if anyone came here hoping to have answered the riddle of the left-footed parrots, but we still haven't worked that out after working on it for 300 years. We're not going to talk about parrots or walruses anymore. We're going to talk about people, which is presumably why you guys are in here. So I just wanted to get a feel for whether or not you think you can tell something about somebody's handedness by just looking at them. So I'm going to show you a picture, and I just want you to, if you feel you could guess if this person was right-handed or left-handed, just say right-handed out loud, okay? Are you ready? Audience participation time. What about this chap? Incorrect, actually. But what about this chap here? I think the answer is pretty obvious. The sun is shining on this gentleman here. He's on the right side of the page. This chap looks arguably a little bit sinister, wouldn't you say? Or would you say sinistral? And of course you'd say sinistral, because in human beings, most of the language we use to describe things related to handedness and sidedness actually is pretty biased towards right-handers like me. Those pictures were both of me, by the way. This recent affectation we'll be talking about later. Right-handers are dextrals, from the Latin dexter. And of course, the word dexterity or dexterous means coordinated and skilled. If somebody's dexterous at some task, for example, that means they're really good at it. Whereas left-handers are sinistrals, from the Latin sinister. And most human languages that have been studied, of course, have some sort of terms that are mildly pejorative about the poor lefty. So gauche for awkward or clumsy from French. I shouldn't dare try to pronounce this in case anybody Norwegian's in the audience, but venstre handsarbeid, left-hand work, means something that's done in a sloppy or unsatisfactory way, which I think is quite a good one. Something not working properly is one of the Bulgarian terms that's pronounced something like lefterin. Somebody in the audience will have to correct me on this one. Would you say chabwitz? I don't know how you pronounce that. Stump-handed was one of my sources, but I wouldn't even dream to try to pronounce this. I haven't been in Wales long enough, which means cack-handed. And I think we're a fairly adult audience. Do we know what's meant by cack-handed? It's the hand you clean yourself with after you go to the toilet, right? This kind of term is around all over the place. Apologies. I think, in fact, what we should do is cut to the chase right now. For several centuries, in fact, left-handers weren't just the subject to a little bit of prejudice. They were actively persecuted. And we know why that is. That's because they worship the devil. Now, I don't have hard evidence for this particular fact, but if you look at some famous left-handers, I think it's easy to make that sort of assumption. But what's important, even though my evidence is sketchy, is that we don't be complacent, because these people are anywhere. Absolutely anywhere. Okay. The pathological lefty. If you look in the popular science literature or look on the World Wide Web and search on left-handedness, you discover, unfortunately, Stefan, that there's a lot of very bad news. For example, there are some types of minor educational difficulties like dyslexia that are associated with them, developmental coordination disorder, specific language impairment has also been linked to left-handedness. We won't say anything because we're a public, polite, obvious audience here about sexual orientation in the left-hander or their other perversities, perhaps, because they worship the devil. Health risks of being left-handed. And in fact, all these bad things probably get passed from generation to generation. So you lefties in the audience, you should be careful about reproducing, because the news is probably bad for your offspring. In fact, this is my favorite. You're going to die sooner. And this story is out there, and this story's around. In fact, about every 5 or 6 years in the popular press, this will appear because it's a slow news cycle. And they show you pictures of famous left-handers, of course, including, bizarrely enough, The Simpsons, who are actually cartoons. But they are left-handed, actually. So what's the data for this kind of case? On this particular graph here, I'll show you age in years of a very, very large study published back around 1980 by Stan Koren and his colleague Halperin. And what's plotted here is the proportion of that sample of people in that sort of age band, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, etc., down from no left-handers whatsoever to up to 15 or 16% left-handedness, which is quite high. And what you see is an undeniable trend from, in rather young cohorts of individuals, left-handers are very well represented. In fact, even there's more of them than I would predict. But by the time you get to 70 or 80-year-olds, they're dead. Now, some of these data were collected in North America, and here's my theory. There's some evidence to show that when you're driving, if something suddenly happens and startles you, you're slightly more likely to pull down with your dominant hand, okay? So for those of you like me who are a little left-right challenged, I'm driving in North America, and I'm driving a very big wheel for the sake of demonstration. I'm driving along, And in North America, when you're on a divided road, where's the oncoming traffic? Who knows? It's over here, isn't it? So if I'm a right-hander and something happens, a beaver, I'm in Canada, a beaver jumps out, and I'm startled, I'll pull my wheel to the right, and I'll end up in the soft shoulder, or maybe in the ditch. But if I'm the Satan-worshipping left-hander, what's going to happen? I'm going to pull my wheel and turn into oncoming traffic and die. Interesting theory. I don't think it works completely because statistically the chances are very good that you'll be killing a right-hander when you turn into the other lane. So I'm not sure I buy this one. In fact, this myth has been exploded in a number of different ways, but this is one of the nicest ones I've seen. It's by my colleague Kenneth Hugdahl, who's now in Bergen, who published this paper 10 years or so later. And what's plotted in this graph is age from 21 to 30, 31 to 40 along this axis, much like as before. The proportion of left-handers in the sample are the black bars, and what you see is something very similar to the data you just saw on the previous slide, that as cohorts get older and older, there is a smaller and smaller proportion of left-handers in that cohort. But I use the word cohort by design here because this is a cohort effect. What he's also plotted is people who were forced to switch their handwriting hands. Because remember, even in Western cultures, in the late 19th, early 20th century, if you were writing with a crayon, that was not a good thing. And either your mom or your dad or the nun at Catholic school would take that crayon out of your hand and put it into the other hand. So what Hugdahl's plotted for us here is the proportion of people who have been forced to write with their right hand. And in the chaps who were in his sample who were over 90, that's all of them. And that's because by the time you do a study in the 1980s, people who are 90 years old were born in 1890. They grew up in various places, even in the Western world, where being left-handed was not such a desirable thing. Yet, this story persists. And so occasionally you see this variant, being left-handed isn't the kiss of death, don't you worry. Here's another version. Some medical group did this monstrous study where they sent out questionnaires for people and chased them up 10 years later and asked them if they were alive or not. And effectively what you get is that over a certain age, sadly, the mortality, I mean, you've never seen a graph like this before, have you? Percent died during study. Can you imagine? At any rate, the functions for the left-handers and the right-handers are the same. So the good news, Dr. Boom, is that chances are, statistically, that you'll last as long as I will. But guess what? Here's one that came out a few years back. Lefties die young. Rightists may have had a hand in a sinister call. I love this idea. It's not car accidents, it's that we're bumping you off over time. Now, what's really quite worrisome is at the end of this little journalist description of this particular study, which I haven't even read, is this last line. I don't know if you can see it down here. We need more research. Like heck do we need more research. There's been plenty of research on this issue, and it's not really a problem. Having said that, some of these other claims about pathology and left-handedness we have to think about a little. So I've had a look at some of that literature for you. You can find lots of references in textbooks and so on and so forth about it. But when you go back and look at original papers, the evidence is a little bit mixed. So here's a perfectly sensible sounding paper published in a perfectly sensible scientific journal, the British Journal of Psychiatry. And what they've done, don't worry about these two different measures, either what the nurses thought your handedness was versus how you scored it on an inventory. What they've plotted is the number of people who are right-handed or left-handed or ambiguous handedness, who had either autism, Down syndrome, or epilepsy. And what you see in the left-handed column are incidences that are a little bit higher than you might expect, especially considering they had an ambidextrous category here. But the good news for your lefties out here is that their sample sizes are trivial. They're tiny. They're so tiny that the difference of one or two people in one group or another really would make a monstrous difference. So I'm not overwhelmed by these kinds of data. In fact, you need big sample sizes. And when you get big sample sizes, the story becomes slightly more complicated. So here's one from a paper published in the late 1980s, percentage of the sample. And this is, they gave a little handedness inventory that had 6 items. So these would be items like hand you write with, hand you throw a ball with, hand you cut bread with, hand you brush your hair with, hand you use a sewing needle. And what's plotted is the number of people in the sample who do either 0 items with their right hand or all 6 items with the right hand. And they have 3 different groups here: normal, which now we'd call neurologically intact, Down syndrome, And I don't know what developmentally retarded means. It's certainly not politically correct, but the sample sizes are certainly reasonable in this study. And what you see is the only real difference of note in these data are that amongst the neurologically intact people, presumably, they have the highest proportion of people who endorse all 6 items with their right hand compared to these other 2 groups here who have slightly smaller proportion. So this does not mean there's a huge proportion of lefties in these samples, does it? All it means, if anything, which isn't particularly interesting to me, is that perhaps some of these groups might be slightly less right-handed, at least in this sample using this crude measure of handedness. So I'm not too worried about that one either. And in fact, the good news for you lefties out there is that the claim is out there in the literature that adextrals may be more than 10% represented in other groups, and groups who we don't think there's some sort of subtle pathology of, let's say, the left hemisphere. In fact, you could even argue that some of these groups, like professional athletes, artists, or architects, might be spatially gifted. And most neuropsychologists, I hope, would agree with me that spatial functions we tend to think of as depending more upon the right hemisphere of the brain. So this is the good news for your lefties. The bad news is the evidence for this is also perhaps not as strong as you'd like it to be. So I'll show you a couple of examples here. Here's a paper I found on differences between artists and scientists at universities. And there are a few other studies like it. And effectively, all they've done is gone to different disciplines at this university, Cincinnati, and just recorded the proportion of the students in the sample, which appears along here, that are left-handed. And as you can see, in behavioral sciences humanities, the number's around 9 or 10%. And again, this is an older paper, so that's probably not totally unreasonable. Whereas in sciences, it's tiny. It's 4%, but out of 92 people. So I don't know how impressed I am by these particular data. What other ones stand out for you? Music, 15%, actually, but again, a sample size of 47, so hard to know. Others has a whopping 15%, but this seems to include people who aren't in any particular college or college major, etc. So that's a hodgepodge category, and it's kind of curious that that seems to have the highest proportion of lefties. So again, not overwhelmingly great evidence. This one's mildly more interesting. This is one about architects, and this was done at an architecture school. And what all they did was they looked at first, second, third, fourth year undergraduates, and then fifth and sixth, presumably master's or postgraduate students, and the number in the sample who are right-handed or left-handed. And in first year, it's about 11%. But then notice what happens. In second year, it's about 16%, 20 in third, 24 in fourth, and then it drops back, again, to still fairly elevated numbers. So my interpretation of these data are that in this particular school, the left-handers are killing the right-handers, right? Because things don't look so unusual in first year. But I don't know what's going on. We'll come back to this idea of left-handers killing right-handers in a moment. Okay. Here's one about athletes. And again, this story appears in the media all the time, often about tennis players, for example. Fencers or other groups, so people who do this fancy business in different categories. But what these authors are claiming here, it's an interactive sports where I am playing against the competitor who is right in front of me. So things like fencing could be ones, badminton, tennis, etc., where you have an opponent. And the idea, I think, is strategic as opposed to visual-spatial. The strategic advantage, if I'm a lefty playing you, Ralph, a right-hander, is that on average, you don't face very many lefties in whatever sport we play. And that gives me a subtle advantage. And what that advantage means is that eventually you start to see higher and higher representations of left-handers in those sports. Although it should kind of flatten out, because if lefties become very common, suddenly you've lost your strategic advantage by being rare. The claim for fencing is something ridiculous, like 40% of top fencers, but I don't really want to comment on that. So what do we think causes handedness? Is it genetic? Does it have to do something with an advantage of being a relatively rare left-hander? So the puzzle genetically is, why is this 10% kind of hanging around? Why aren't we 50-50? Why doesn't handedness just happen according to chance? Or why don't we see 100% right-handedness? The left-hander should disappear. So that's one way to articulate the problem. Is handedness all learned anyway? And in fact, this is what geneticists who review your grants that are about handedness and genetics say in their reviews. They say, oh, it's all learned. It has nothing to do with anything else. Or, and the idea I'm going to push is, are there right hemisphere advantages for some left-handers and perhaps to go along with left hemisphere related disadvantages for other left-handers? So is it genetic? One big problem is if you have identical twins, so what we call monozygotic twins who share their genome, if the thing was under genetic control, you'd expect twins to be concordant. So if one twin was left-handed, the other twin should be left-handed, and so on. But actually, about 1 in every 5 pairs are discordant for handedness. So in other words, one of the twins will be left-handed, one will be right-handed. That's problematic for genetic models, actually, but we can talk about that in the discussion. But if you look in large samples of families and you look at the handedness of the parents, what's the chance of any of the offspring being a left-hander? And the answer is if you're both right-handed, chances of one of your children being left-handed, or if you had a single child being a left-hander, is a little less than 10%. If one of the two, either a mom or dad, is a left-hander, this goes up to something approximately equal to 20%. And if they're both lefties, it goes up to about 25%. So this is suggestive of some genetic component, but it's not obvious in any kind of Mendelian genetics that they taught me to school how that would work exactly. So it's certainly not completely genetically determined as far as we can tell. So this other argument is about evolutionary history of our species, and maybe there's some advantage of being a relatively rare left-hander. And this is articulated most by these guys, Fowey and Raymond, who are also big on the story about left-handers in competitive sports. But the argument is basically that they have an advantage in violent conflict. For the same reason that a left-hander might have an advantage in fencing, he or she might have an advantage if we get into a violent conflict over some resource, let's say. And of course, some of these models might refer to early hominid species far, far away in our evolutionary history. But what these guys claim, actually, is that there's still a relationship that you can see today. So what's plotted here is the homicide rate, number of adult homicides per 1,000 people in the group per year, against the proportion of left-handers in a bunch of traditional societies. And lo and behold, the relationship between those two things looks very, very strong. So wow, in those violent societies when lots of people are dying, left-handers are doing well. So remember what I said about left-handers killing off the rest of us? Here's your evidence, so watch them. At any rate, again, if the devil's in the detail as usual, if you look at the sample size, so here are their estimates of percentage of left-handers in the different samples, which vary from about 4% to as high as 23%. But then if you look over here at the sample size, you have 64 people in this one sample of the Inuit, or 37 in this one sample where they're claiming this whopping incidence of left-handedness. And you have similar kinds of issues over here. If you only have 535 people in your entire population, what are you to make of 0.5 homicides per 1,000? You know, it's probably not a very reliable number. Maybe this whole handedness malarkey is just learned. We used to have social pressures against being a left-hander. Left-handers are more likely to come from families with at least one, maybe two left-handed parents, right? Again, I'm not completely convinced by that argument, but there's some evidence for it in a weird way. So what's plotted on this graph is data from a bunch of different samples looking at year of birth from 1900 to 1970. And this is percentage left-handed along here. So up here is 15%, down here is 0. And here's data for men in this black line, and for women in this kind of gray line that the authors have filled in with gray underneath. And there's a couple of noteworthy things to pay attention to here. One is that the incidence of left-handedness has been steadily increasing over once you get to people who were born by about 1940 or 1950. Now that shouldn't happen. There aren't many evolutionary models, aside for things having to do with lactose intolerance or anything, that should change in sort of 40 or 50 years. In fact, what many psychologists would say, the social pressures of the adextral pressures, where the sister would actually take the crayon out of your left hand and put it in your right hand, probably leveled off in places in Canada and America and Britain, probably around World War II. And strangely enough, their estimates start to get pretty reliable around that period of time. The other thing that's kind of noteworthy is, are there more social pressures on females to be left-handed than there are social pressures on males? Guys, are we just a little more resistant to those sorts of social pressures or what? No. This is something that we really think is a biological difference between men and women, and we don't have an explanation for it. So we may come back to that. So yes, there has been some change in the incidence of left-handedness, but you have to think about this scale. If you look about other sources of data, there's some evidence to suggest that we've been pretty right-handed, more or less, to the same amount for thousands of years. So these are data from these interesting negatives that you do. And I think the idea is you take your hand and you put it on the cave wall, and you take some pigment and you put it in a tube, and you blow the pigment against your hand, creating these kinds of negatives that you can see up here. And what's interesting about them is that you see far more left-hand negatives than you do right-hand negatives. And what these authors have done is they've taken a bunch of French undergraduate students and had them make these things and not told them what to do. And lo and behold, if you have a random sample of French undergraduates, I guess, most of these things, around 80%, are going to end up being of the left hand. That might be because you're holding the tube with your right hand or you're loading the tube or something like that. And this is not very different from the kinds of proportions of left and right hands that you see in these old Paleolithic cave ones. Of course, with these data, much like our walrus chums down sitting on the murky bottom, you can't know how many different artists made these things at any given location. It might have been a really sexy thing to be one of these negative artists back in Paleolithic times, and you went around to different caves. Hey, I'll give you one of my hands. You don't know. This is interesting data too. Again, it's not very conclusive. What's plotted here is the proportion of works of art over the past 5,000 years in which a person is shown using the right hand in the gray bar down below and the left hand in the white bars up above from, prehistoric art, pre-3000 BC, up to around 1950 AD. And again, the estimates are pretty consistent. So for whatever reason, when artists are producing paintings, murals, etc., people doing stuff, it's about 85, 90% of the stuff is being done by the right hand of the people depicted, whereas about 10 or 15% is being done by the left hand. So again, these differences, there might be, you can make some arguments about historical, maybe greater amounts of pressure at different times historically against being left-handed and such, but I suspect this doesn't account for a lot of the variability. So are there right hemisphere related advantages for some left-handers or left hemisphere disadvantages for others? And I would argue many of you lefties, as you'll see in a couple of slides, should be right-handed. And I'll show you why in a second. But first, I just want to do a little experiment. Cerebral lateralization doesn't mean one hemisphere is dominant and one is recessive or anything bizarre like that, or that one hemisphere does everything and the other does nothing. It's just a tendency for one of your two hemispheres to excel at something, to be a little bit better. It doesn't mean the other hemisphere doesn't participate. So we're going to do an experiment. So to do this experiment, I'm going to show you two faces. Some of you know this already, but I want you to forget what you know. I'll show you a face on top and a face on a bottom. I want you to look in them both quickly and decide which face is the happier one, okay? Top or bottom. And then I want you to take a record of which one you pick, top or bottom. So write it on your hand, remember it, I don't mind what you do. No, T for top, B for bottom, jot it down somewhere. We'll do a show of hands later. Don't make your first impression. Don't look around at what other people say. Don't look at what the people beside you do. Just decide. Is that clear? No consulting your neighbor's page. So do you know what you have to do? Because when I do this with my undergrads, some of them muck it up, but you look like a very intelligent audience. So you ready? Two faces, look at them quickly and decide. Don't say it out loud. Do it in your head, top or bottom. Ready? Okay? Do you need one more little peek? Those are top or bottom. I was confused. You want to see it again? Okay? Decide or write it down. Top or bottom. Forced choice. No non-participants here. We're not really a big enough sample for this to work. I need all of you to try. So you got it? Okay, I'll ask you about it in a minute. I just want to show you. These things are chimeric faces. You can make them in all kinds of different ways. One way to make them is take a frontal photograph of a person and create composites created of the two halves of the face. So which one looks, you don't have to show me, but which one looks more like this guy? This one or this one? Who thinks this one? Who thinks this one? Okay, all right. Anyway, let's see the numbers for that other one, which I usually have a pretty good idea of what might happen. So how many of you picked top? Raise your hands and have a look around the audience because you'll think I'm cheating. So hands up, nice and high. Okay, how many picked bottom? Okay, here's my prediction. And clearly, I have not had a chance to edit this slide. Actually, right-handers only. All right-handers in the room, raise your hand. Okay? Now look around, how many right-handers are here? Lots. If you pick top, keep your hand up. Okay, I don't know. Is there a mathematician or an accountant in the audience who could count these for me? My prediction is the righties most would pick top. 70% is probably a little generous, actually, might have been a little lower than that. But if you lefties in the audience, I know there are not many of you, hands up. How many picked top? Keep your hand up. Tricky, 1, 2. That should be an easy mathematical problem for me, but I just can't count that quickly. Anyway, here was the top one, and here's the bottom one. And as you've probably gathered by now, how they differ is which half of the face is the happy part. It's the left part of this one. It's the right part of this one. Now, what's weird about that demonstration is, even though your visual fields are crossed, etc., you looked at those things with both your eyes open. You could have looked any way you wanted. And for some of you, myself included, who still sees it? Top is happier. You see it? Yeah, not all of you, but it works for me every time. Okay. In epileptic patients for a long period of time, in fact, even currently, before you do surgery to take out the bad bit of the cortex, you want to ascertain which side of the brain is crucial for speech and language and verbal memory. And so one way to do that, fairly non-invasive way to do that, is have your patient come in early on, anesthetize one hemisphere or the other, and see if the person can still speak. Then you bring them back a week later after the anesthetic goes away, and you anesthetize the other hemisphere. And by doing this with large samples of dextrals, right-handers, and adextrals, you can say what proportion of those dextrals depend upon their left hemisphere or their right hemisphere or are bilateral. There's two different ways to be bilateral, but that's not important. And if you're a right-hander, chances are extremely good that your left hemisphere is dominant for speech. If you anesthetize that hemisphere, you can't speak anymore. If you anesthetize the other hemisphere, you still can speak. But interestingly enough, a small proportion of the righties actually are right hemisphere dominant. Now, what the aphasiologists used to think is that you non-right-handers, so this would be anybody who's pretty ambidextrous or left-handed, that you'd be the opposite way around. It should be 95-0-5. But clearly you're not. Something strange is going on here. And 70% of you who should be right-handed, that would be my argument. So my research really, some of my newer research is designed to try to find ways out of a room full of 100 left-handers or adextrals. How could I narrow down these 15 who are right hemisphere dominant? But actually, it also would be really cool because you right-handers are more numerous, you're more numerous. There's lots of you. If I could use the same principle to find the 5% who are right hemisphere dominant, that would be terrific for all kinds of reasons. So what does the side of your brain dominant for speech and language have to do with your hands? Well, for everybody, the anatomy is the same. The left hemisphere of your brain is important for control of your right hand. The right hemisphere of your brain is important for control of your left hand. And if you think about the motor control requirements of speech, you have to control a lot of muscles to do what I'm doing to you, right? I shouldn't start thinking about it. I'll be the centipede that trips over his legs. But I'm controlling my tongue, my larynx, my pharynx, my breathing, my jaw, etc. in pretty complicated ways. So it makes sense for me to be a right-hander because that's the side of my brain that does speech and language. So the mystery there is that large proportion of left-handers who don't do what almost all right-handers do prefer to use the hand that's controlled by the hemisphere that does speech and language. So a lot of my research has to do with attentional biases in right-handers in particular, and I won't bore you with those details now because we're running out of time. These things aren't quite the same in right-handers and left-handers, which they should not be. They just had to do with handwriting hand. But I wanted to show you one little piece of data. This is a project we're working on now where basically participants are making bimanual movements, but they have to stop one hand or the other. And we give them various amounts of warning from 100 milliseconds, and this is the proportion of successful stops. So if you're getting up here to 0.8, you're doing a pretty good job at stopping one hand or the other when I tell you to before you make your bimanual movement. But when I give you no warning, when I give you the stop signal at the same time as the go signal, you prepared that movement, you're waiting for a go signal, then people are pretty poor at stopping. But what's remarkable about these data is that a bunch of right-handed people are actually better at the task with their left hand. It's harder to stop your preferred hand once you're prepared to use it, whereas stopping your non-preferred hand is kind of easy. So that's the interesting thing about that. It's not the only advantage that right-handers have, a paradoxical advantage for using their left hand. So this is the other thing we're working on. We're working on differences in speed and accuracy and skill for a very, very simple motor task where you're fixating on a central fixation line, and I present targets to one side of that fixation line or the other. And your job is just to put your finger on that target as fast as you can. And so I'm going to show you a graph of data from one participant where red means the left hand is faster. So if you see a red circle, the left hand is faster at that than the right hand at that particular target location. So I'm going to show you a map of hand differences in one participant. Whereas if there's a blue circle at that location, that means the right hand is faster. and I'm going to show you the data for reaction time. So this is when this participant, we'll call him David CA, doesn't know when the target's going to appear. He's fixating straight ahead, and I flash targets in all kinds of different positions, and we see how long it takes for him to move. And the bottom line is, David Carey, who's very right-handed, let me tell you, is much, much faster at getting off the mark with his left hand than his right hand. So you see more red than blue. Is that clear? You also may notice that it really is true on the left side of space, not quite so true on the right side of space. Now what's remarkable is that in our version of this task, this works in everybody. So in the sample we've tested so far, just about everybody shows, it's a little bit noisy, but just about everybody shows more red than blue, especially on the left side of the case, except about one person in every, I don't know, 20 or 22 who shows more blue than red. Now the key thing here, if this is a marker that's related to brain asymmetry, it's an unusual one, but we can talk about that in a second, then you'd expect most right-handers to show the same pattern, but left-handers should not show the same pattern. They should show a very unusual pattern if it was a perfect marker. And that would be 70% of a group of left-handers would look like that. Now that isn't what's happening so far, but it's too early for us to tell. So these are a couple of left-handers that I tested in Scotland before I came here to Aberdeen, came here to Bangor last year. Some of them show the sort of usual right-handed pattern, which is to be better at this task with your left hand, but some of them are the other way around. And I just wanted to show you quickly our first left-hander, data from our first left-hander who we tested a couple of weeks ago in our lab. And there are a couple of things to notice. One, this particular he or she actually is better with their right hand than their left in this task. But the more important thing is, this graph is much prettier than the ones I showed you before that we made in Aberdeen. So the Welsh graphs are clearly superior to the Scottish graphs. I think you would all agree. The other, I'm out of time really. The other type of research that we're working on now has to do with looking how right-handed or left-handed people are for different kinds of tasks. And what motivated this experiment was, well, you're right-handed for writing if you're a right-handed writer, but are you right-handed for everything else? Do you reach and grasp more with your right hand? Do you scratch your head more with your right hand? Do you gesture more when you speak with your right hand compared to your left hand? And we're doing those experiments in a couple of different ways. One way is to capitalize on the fact that we've got a nice random sample of famous people here sitting around a circular table, talking and arguing and drinking wine and eating their steak on a commercial program called Dinner for Five. Another great source of these kind of data is reality television, where you have lots of people putting on their makeup, eating breakfast, eating lunch, arguing with one another, gesturing, reaching and grasping, and so on and so forth. And the last way we've been looking at this kind of question is we're looking at politicians gesturing in speeches. So here are three famous left-handers, Obama, Clinton, and our Prime Minister. And what we've plotted here is our early data of how often in some of their public speeches that you can see on the web that they gesture with their left hand in this kind of lighter color and the right hand in this sort of darker color. And Obama and Clinton indeed make more of their gestures when they use only one hand with their left hand. But our devil-worshipping Prime Minister here, I'm actually recording this, I probably shouldn't be saying that, he actually is gesturing more with his non-preferred hand, even though, as you can see from the evidence, he's a left-hander here. Okay, let's conclude. Human beings are remarkably one-handed, and I would argue, parrots excluded perhaps, we're probably the most one-sided species on the planet. And the minority variant, this left-handedness, is subject to a lot of mythology. Now, some of that mythology is negative, and maybe the evidence isn't so solid for it. A little bit of it is positive, and I'm not convinced it's that solid either. We still have to work on that, and I think we would do better if we could classify left-handers more accurately. We do know that in humans, handedness is related to cerebral asymmetries for speech and language. This is also true for faces. I showed you that example in yourselves today. Some attentional functions, and maybe even some emotional functions. But these ways that handedness are related to cerebral asymmetries, we still don't understand. My lab is working on finding ways of classifying subgroups of non-right-handers in particular, but right-handers as well, using measures of hand choice, what do people do with one hand or the other, as well as hand speed and skill in motor tasks like visually guided reaching. There's some other things we're doing as well. If you enjoyed this talk, my last comment is there will be a mustached man in the back who's sitting right there, Dr. Chris Saville, who's going to be passing around this little box which says Movember on it, because the reason why I'm looking so sinister is because I'm growing this for a charity promoting men's health. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much. There's a man at the back.
Yeah, go on.
Is it true that most polar bears are left-handed? Is that?
Is it true that most polar bears are left-handed? I've heard this one before. It's a myth that originated with a story, I think, that was told by some Inuit hunter. But I don't know anyone who's actually tried to collect the data. Come here, polar bear. Here's some nice whelk. We're going to put it between two pillows. We want you to reach over with your hand. So I suspect it's a myth.
I just want to go back to your reaching data there,
Yep.
David. You've got one where it seems we're better at stopping with our right hand than our left. Is that correct?
No, we're better at stopping with our
Left hand. And yet we're faster with our left hand to go.
That's right.
So don't they sort of contradict each other there? Doesn't one say that one result seems to imply that we're more excitable with our right,
Yep.
so less able to stop, whereas the other one seems to imply they're actually, it's the other way around.
Yep.
How do you explain that?
Well, I can't explain it yet, Dr. Mullins, but my theory about it is that this one has to do with the fact that if you have a strong hand bias, you're very, very likely to have difficulty inhibiting that particular hand bias. So this one has more to do with hand choice than something else. Now, this left-hand reaction time advantage, we don't know what it is. There are a couple of different models. One is it's because the right hemisphere in people with conventional cerebral dominance, so right-handers for the most part, the left hemisphere is important for speech and language, whereas the right hemisphere is important for tasks like visual spatial localization. And so in early parts of this task, where you're fixating and a target suddenly appears, when your brain is working out where is that target, where am I going to turn my eyes and my head to, and how am I going to move my hand to it, the right hemisphere plays a bit more of a role, and that empowers the left hand in some way to get off the mark faster. What I didn't tell you is once you start moving, if you're right-handed, the right hand always wins. It reaches higher peak velocity, it has shorter durations, and it's more accurate, or at least equivalent in accuracy. So we have a couple of ideas about how we're going to manipulate things to show whether these effects have to do with visual spatial localization or attention or something else.
I'm a bit scared of the microphone.
Oh, you're
Is that
scared.
okay? I just wondered, how do the characteristics for left-hand/right-hand people change for those left-handed people who had to relearn it and use their right hand? Would they, I mean, if there is enough research, would they more resemble those who were born right-handed?
Yeah, okay. Is my mic still live? I'm still live, yeah. The question, I think, has to do with handedness switch. So people who are compelled to use their right hand for tasks like writing. They're a remarkably understudied group, actually, and this is a tragedy because they're disappearing, at least in Western countries, because people don't feel the stigma to force their kids to write with their right hand anymore. All that's really known, there's a little bit of neuroimaging work where they look at blood flow doing various tasks, but the more interesting finding in that study was that in left-handers who successfully switch, or are switched, they're more likely to be ambidextrous for lots of other tasks. So for example, left-handers, bizarrely enough, we can ask them, we don't have enough here, about a third of them prefer to throw with their non-preferred hand. So they would throw with their right hand, even though they're left-handed for tasks like writing. Now, for those of us in the audience who are right-handed, that's unthinkable. This one is, you know, forget about it. So it looks like handedness switch is more effective in left-handers who are probably a little more on the ambidextrous end of things than not. In some of these individuals, handedness switch just does not take. When you give handedness questionnaires to right-handers and left-handers, what you get is you do get a proportion of the left-handers who look the opposite to us. They're left-handed for everything. They may also have concurrent side preferences for other tasks, like kicking a ball or the eye that you sight with when we force you to under. So it's a great question. The answer is they're grossly understudied, and what I've just told you is about all we know about people who've been forced to switch hands. These things are plastic. You can learn to do things the other way around. So bimanual things like batting or golf, a lot of people can do those things. Not a lot, but people can do those things even if they're quite right-sided or left-sided for other tasks. And there are some arguments to suggest that you can pick up a lot of these skills through forced practice. So if your arm is broken for a period of time, you can teach yourself to write with your non-preferred arm. How that manifests itself in changes in the brain, etc., we don't know. It's a good question.
Yes, me. David, thank you very much. Do you want to say anything about the lateral cradling bias? And because I haven't kept up with that literature for a while, do you know anything, or have you kept up with it better than me, and know something about the non-human primate literature, because I thought there was a reasonable left-sided bias for those non-human primate species.
This is I'll give the short answer to that question. Professor Turnbull, who asked the question, is one of the former world authorities on cradling bias. So it turns out we have lots of lateral asymmetries actually that you don't know about. So imagine right now that I'm standing right in front of you and I'm going to hand you my infant son. Ralph, I'm handing you my son. Take him in your arms and cradle him. So everybody try this. Try it. Which way do you do it? So again, some of you are parents and have experience. Some of you are grandparents have experience. Some of you have no experience. It doesn't matter. You can do this with a doll. You can do this with a doll with people who say, I've never held a child in my life and I have no interest. How many of you prefer to cradle with your left hand? Raise your hands. Left hand? How many of you prefer to cradle with your left side? Hands up. Right side? More of a left-sided advantage, right? This is well known. It exists in right-handers and left-handers. And Professor Turnbull and myself disagree on the interpretation of that lack of a difference. I don't know what's happened in the non-human primate literature on cradling out and what's happened in the cradling literature. My guess, which Professor Turnbull disagrees with, is that there are two things going on in cradling. Although he pointed out to me many years ago, there's a great attribution error that somebody is making. If you go to a right-hander and say, Ralph, why did you cradle with your left hand? Ralph will say, well, I need my right hand free to stir the soup and to answer the phone and to open the door and to do my chores. If I ask a left-hander, Wendy, why do you cradle with your left hand? The left-hander says, hey, this is dependable. I don't want to drop your son. So somebody's got to be wrong. I mean, I guess both of those explanations can work. Don't know the answer. Ralph, you had a question?
Most creatures like us are symmetrical physically, so there's no reason why I shouldn't use my left and my right hand. But what happens in animals like lobsters and insects and other things that actually have asymmetrical bodies? Do they show any bias to develop a particular physical feature like a large claw on one side? Do they show any sort of...
Yeah, so the question is, in many species such as ourselves, we're bilaterally pretty symmetrical. In fact, it's pretty surprising that you have a preferred side at all. Why do you, etc. But in a lot of others, in some other species, you can have asymmetrical body parts. And what was the last part of the question?
Well, just do they show any bias to develop on a particular side?
Well, you would have to ask a marine biologist, I suspect, or someone else. Yeah, I mean, you can have functional specialization of the two limbs, so they do different things.
I think half of them have got really big claws on the right side and half really big on the left side. I think it's
oh, I see. Okay.
symmetrical.
Now, there might be, you can imagine a genetic mutation occurring early in the development of a species which might bias them towards one-sidedness, but then I'd expect very strong one-sidedness, something that looked like 90 or 100%, and when you had bias to the other side, that would be some genetic mutation, etc. Or I'd expect what Professor Turnbull suggests, 50-50, something like. Anyone else? Yes, sir. Do you want the mic?
No, thanks. Are there any studies regarding children during their infant years and their rates undergoing lateralization?
Are there any studies of infants in early years when they're still undergoing lateralization? Zillions. I don't know many of them. Some of the handedness ones I do. And they have to do with the developmental time course in which handedness appears and whether or not you can predict handedness early on. So, for example, one finding that's frequently cited suggests that if you look at a whole series of unselected ultrasound scans of women, and you can see that fetus sucking their right thumb or left thumb, about 90% suck their right thumb. When kids appear, there's a developmental stage, I'm trying to remember the exact years. It can be as late as 4 years old. I mean, parents here would know better than me, where handedness fluctuates, where it can look for a while like your daughter's going to be left-handed, and then 2 months later she's looking two-handed, and then 2 months after that she's looking right-handed. So there's a developmental time course to it. So there might be some, I suspect there is a strong genetic predisposition for the handedness stuff. Regarding cerebral asymmetry, good question. I think some of the evidence suggests that strong asymmetries that you see on tasks like that one I just showed you, they take a little longer to appear. You don't see these biases in very young infants at any rate, but I would have to check. Okay, I've just gotten it's very, very late this evening, and I've just gotten the hook from our organizer, but many thanks for everybody for staying out so late. Hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.